Good afternoon. My name is Josephine Olson, and I am the Interim Director of the European Studies Center at the University of Pittsburgh. Welcome to this month's Conversation on Europe, which is part of our year of conversations on challenges facing Europe. Today's topic is the UK after Boris. You will have the opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A function, not the chat. Please feel free to post a question at any time during the discussion. We will try to get to as many of these as we can. Today's conversation is sponsored by the European Studies Center, which is part of the University Center of International Studies at Pitt. It is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. Our co-sponsors are the Georgia Tech Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, the Miami, Florida Jean Monnet Center of Excellence, the European Union Center at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Florida, and the Center for European Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. To learn more about our upcoming conversations on Europe, as well as other programming, please visit our website, which is www.pitt.edu/ESC, but we'll put that in the chat for you. Here you can find also recordings of past conversations and additional materials. I would like to thank Ingrid Gomez, Allison Delnor, and Kathleen Brett for their help in today's event. Now I'd like to turn the program over to Dr. Jae-Jae Spoon of the University of Pittsburgh. Jae-Jae is Professor of Political Science and Chairman of the department. Previously, she was Director of the European Studies Center. She will introduce the panelists and moderate the discussion. Jae-Jae?
Great, thanks, Joe, and welcome everyone. So the week of September 5th saw an unprecedented change in the UK, the naming of a new Prime Minister, the death of Queen Elizabeth II, and the subsequent beginning of the reign of Charles III. This all comes at a time when the UK is facing an inflation rate of over 10%, the highest rate in nearly 40 years, a rising cost of living, and soaring energy costs, due in part to the fallout from COVID, the war in Ukraine, and Brexit. Today, I'm joined by 4 experts who focus on public opinion, parties, and electoral politics in the UK to discuss the state of the UK in these unprecedented times. First, I'd like to welcome Tim Bale, who is Professor of Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. He's the former Deputy Director of the think tank UK in Changing Europe. Among his publications is the forthcoming The Conservative Party After Brexit, Turmoil and Transformation. Welcome, Tim. Next, I'm pleased to welcome Robert Ford, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester. Among his publications are Revolt on the Right, which examined the rise of the UK Independence Party. And I am also very pleased to welcome Rob Johns, who is Professor of Government at the University of Essex. He's a principal investigator on the 2021 Scottish election study, and among his publications are Britain at the Polls in 2017. We will hopefully be joined by a 4th panelist, and I will introduce her when she joins. So we have lots to discuss in the next hour and 20 minutes. And as Joe said, we encourage all questions from the audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A, or if you have comments that you'd like everyone to see, feel free to put that in the chat. And I will get to as many of these as I can. So to start us off, Tim, I'm going to turn to you and get us started by talking a bit about the UK's new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, who has been in her position for just about 2 weeks now. So, Tim?
Yeah, Liz Truss has been the cabinet minister under 3 different Conservative prime ministers. She came into the House of Commons in, I think, 2010, and she first joined the government in 2014. She has always been seen, I think, as on the, if you like, market liberal side of the Conservative Party, seen by some as a bit of an ideologue. But given that she has served under 3 very different prime ministers, she's probably considerably more flexible than some people imagine. She, by the time of Boris Johnson's downfall, was Foreign Secretary. She's also been Trade Secretary, in which she did some post-Brexit deals for the government, of which she made a great deal. She was mainly famous, I think, during her time as a cabinet minister for her almost permanent campaign for the leadership. She was very much an Instagram politician. Lots of photos posted of her doing supposedly incredibly exciting and valuable work for Britain overseas. And some accused her of cosplaying Margaret Thatcher. Pictures of her in a tank, for example, pictures of her in Moscow with a furry hat on. She was able to win the Conservative leadership contest against Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, and partly because she was loyal unto the end to Boris Johnson, and partly because she told Conservative Party members who had the ultimate say in who would become the new leader, and telling them what they wanted to hear, essentially, particularly on tax cuts. She hasn't been in power that long, as you say. We are expecting a mini budget on Friday, in which she is expected to announce some pretty radical departures from the economic policy pursued by Boris Johnson. She's expected to announce big tax cuts and expected to allow borrowing to take the strain rather than, as many fiscal conservatives would have preferred, perhaps a little bit more fiscal consolidation and even some tax rises.
Sorry, I'm doing what everyone still does on Zoom, which is to talk with being muted. So I apologize for that. After 2 years, apparently, we're still can't figure things out. Tim, I wonder if you could, for those in the audience that may be less familiar with, maybe stepping back and giving everyone a sense of how she got to be where she is. So kind of walking through the Conservative Party leadership.
Sure. Okay, the Conservative Party held a leadership election this summer. That was precipitated by the fall of Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson had been subject to a confidence vote in the parliamentary party, which he just managed to win, but there was another scandal after that which affected him, and he wasn't able to survive that. He was subject to, I think it was in the end 59 ministers abandoning the government and forcing, in effect, his resignation. He was very reluctant to go, but go he did. That triggered the leadership contest. And in the Conservative Party, that is a two-stage contest. The first stage involves just the members of Parliament, so 350 odd Conservative members of Parliament, who vote in a series of exhaustive ballots to reduce the field down to just 2 people. And those 2 people, and it was Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who had resigned from Johnson's government, they then face a ballot of all the members in the grassroots of the Conservative Party, of which there are around 160,000. There were various TV debates, various hustings over August, and then in September, we got the announcement that Liz Truss had won on a vote of 57% to 43%. Of course, many people would challenge the legitimacy of a process that chooses the Prime Minister of a country based on 0.2 or 0.3% of the British electorate, but them's the rules, and so Liz Truss became the Prime Minister.
So I think that raises a really interesting point, actually, and thank you for sort of providing that background. Is there any pushback among the public, given that the Prime Minister, whether it is whichever party, is selected by such a small percentage of the population and arguably not a very representative part of the population?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that most people don't think it's a great way to choose their next Prime Minister. If you look at opinion polling, and my colleagues will be able to tell you a little bit more about that, people will tell opinion pollsters that they would prefer an election to take place in order for a new Prime Minister to come into office. Whether they actually mean that is another matter. whether most people would actually like to go through a general election in order to choose another prime minister, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, you're right. There are some doubts as to whether this is fair, particularly because the Conservative Party membership is highly unrepresentative of the British electorate as a whole. It's far more likely to be male. It's generally speaking much older than the rest of the population. It's certainly much whiter than the rest of the population. The ethnic minority population of the country is around 15%, but around 97, 98% of Conservative Party members are white British, for example. It's also the case that if you include London, over half of them live in the southern half of the country as well. And they are very, very Brexity in the sense of around 70 to 80% of them will have voted for Brexit in 2016. And if people remember, the actual vote was 52-48, so unrepresentative in that sense, and unrepresentative in the sense that although they're not quite as enthusiastic, for market liberalism as the Conservative Parliamentary Party, they are still far more inclined towards, if you like, market-based solutions to economic problems than the rest of the public, including actually many people who switched to voting for the Conservatives back in 2019.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that provides, a good sense of I think of where things stand in terms of how she got there and how representative or perhaps non-representative. I want to turn to, and hopefully our colleague, or she should be joining us shortly, but and can jump in on the conversation, Jane Green. But Robert Ford, I wonder if you can jump in now and talk a bit more on sort of the public's view of you can take this as the public's view of the process that got us to Liz Truss, or of Liz Truss herself. So what do we know about kind of the public's perception at this point?
Well, I mean, on views of the process, I'm not sure the public really pay that much attention to the processology of it. It gets a lot of coverage in the press, this issue of small unrepresentative membership electing a leader. There isn't really that much evidence that the public at large are particularly troubled by that process. I think they were frustrated by the fact that politics was essentially put on hold for several months when there was an awful lot of rather urgent issues on the agenda, number one. And number two, I don't think the process helped with your second question in terms of public perceptions of Liz Truss, because what you had essentially was both Truss and Sunak trying to appeal to a very unrepresentative tiny slice of the electorate, and therefore repeatedly saying things that the broader electorate at large doesn't necessarily like or want to hear. And when we look at polling on Truss, it's better than polling on Johnson was at the time that he left, but that's really a very low bar to clear indeed. By the time he departed from office, Johnson was close to setting records for some of the worst polling figures we've seen for any incumbent prime minister on lots of things. So people probably give Truss a little bit of credit for not being him, but they aren't particularly confident. So to take some YouGov polling that was published just recently, competent or incompetent, Johnson 66% incompetent, 23% competent, Truss 45% incompetent, 21% competent, and 34% haven't made their minds up yet. And it continues along similar lines to that. Decisive or indecisive, 2/3 of people think Johnson's indecisive and a quarter are decisive. Truss gets 40% indecisive, 20% indecisive, and lots don't know. All of them are pretty similar: strong, weak, likable, dislikable. She starts underwater on all of those things, and then there's a big chunk who don't know, and not a very large chunk that are positive. So glass half empty answer to that is she's starting in a pretty poor position. Glass half full answer is there's a pretty big chunk of the electorate that haven't made their minds up yet and are willing to judge her based on what happens in coming weeks.
you think, and Rob Johns, you can jump in on this as well, that the passing of the Queen, her presence at the funeral, the remarks that she gave will change the public's view of her in terms of competence, in terms of what, you know, the public's perception is of her?
I doubt it will massively move the dial on its own, but what I think is probably helpful from Liz Truss's perspective is that it's very unusual for political events to be put on pause for an extended period of time. And we've had roughly 10 days where the news agenda has entirely been dominated by one story, and it's not a particularly political story. So it's given her time potentially to prepare her stall, as it were, to get her messages and her policies organized, ready for a kind of incoming blitz. And that's a luxury most new leaders don't get. And so it's going to be interesting to see in coming days whether or not she's taken advantage of that.
Great, great, thank you. So I want to just pause for a moment and introduce our fourth panelist who has joined us. So Jane Green is Professor of Political Science and British Politics at Nuffield College at the University of Oxford, and she's the co-director of the British Election Study. Among her publications are Electoral Shocks, Understanding the Volatile Voter in a Turbulent World. So welcome, Jane. And
thank you. Sorry about the time mess up.
That's okay. That's okay. Oop, we've just lost you. All right. Oh, and you're back. Okay. So Jane, maybe I'll just bring you into the conversation. We were talking, started out talking a bit about Liz Truss, about public perceptions of her, as well as the sort of nomination process, and what when you joined us, Robert was talking about so the potential for sort of the public's perception of her to change, especially in terms of her competence based on her presence at the Queen's funeral yesterday, remarks that she gave, etc. And if you want to offer your thoughts on that, you're welcome to.
On Liz Truss's, like the possibility that what she's saying and doing is lending a degree of competence to her reputation. So it's really, from my perspective, it's really early days. I mean, what do we know? We know that about a fifth of Conservative voters in the last election are now undecided about how they're going to vote in the next election. And we also know that there are a kind of quite a significant proportion of former Conservative voters from the 2019 election that have gone back to the Labour Party. Now, if we think that, you know, the reason for that, those two shifts, one is those people who are undecided, and the other is those people going to the Labour Party. You know, do we believe that Liz Truss has enough to convince those particular individuals to go back to the Conservatives? I guess it depends on why they've moved to undecided, and it depends on why they've moved to Labour. So why they've moved to Labour, I think a lot of this is indeed about the economic crisis and about voters who feel economically insecure, who feel very, very concerned about their economic prospects and their precarity in the current context. In particular, Labour leavers, so possibly those older Labour voters who had gone to the Conservatives in 2019, hoping for, you know, more hopeful days, for better, you know, better prospects in a post-Brexit world, and being disappointed. So she currently has something to offer those people with the energy bailout. She currently has something to offer those people because she's taking the same similar kind of very hardline Brexit line that Boris Johnson took, but can she offer them an economic recovery? And I think, you know, sorry, I just was brought a drink, thank you very much. I've just walked in the door, so running from a train just to join you. It's just really early days. I mean, she has to deliver on the economy, and that's spectacularly difficult. And I don't think anything very, very short term that she does or says in relation to kind of yesterday's events or proceedings is going to be enough to shift that.
Great, thank you. I'll let you grab a drink of water. Sorry. Rob, what's the sense in Scotland? On perceptions and on what you've been hearing from folks there?
Well, not hugely positive, but as in England, less negative than of Boris Johnson. But I think that there's a parallel in Scotland with what Jane was just talking about elsewhere, which is, I think it's too early for us to tell how she will perform as an individual, as a kind of presidentialized prime minister. I think there are reasons to be pessimistic, but I think it's definitely can be pulled out the bag. But the problems for her are structural, and they're structural in Scotland, where her party is kind of is unrescuably unpopular, it seems, or can't get over a certain kind of threshold. And there are structural problems facing her government in the UK as a whole, most of which are economic or kind of economic related. So I agree with the kind of early days assessment. I don't know what the others would think. I mean, we probably shouldn't be speculating on whether she will have the kind of appealing personality, and much of that will depend on how she's presented by the media. And I do think that the first few days have been a help to her in that regard, because it would have been pretty hard not to seem at least somewhat serious and have a touch of authority when in a pulpit. But yeah, I also think that there are kind of grounds for doubt about her kind of what you might call her valence credentials. So it's going to be interesting to see, and I think we should see fairly soon.
Great, thank you.
Can I just jump in there?
Yeah, please do.
I mean, the image of Liz Truss in the media, certainly before she became leader, was someone who was perhaps a little bit awkward, who certainly didn't possess the charisma of Boris Johnson. In fact, didn't possess much charisma at all. The image, I think, improved slightly over the course of the leadership contest, and in some ways she made a virtue of the fact that she wasn't quite so free and easy, as, if you like, as many politicians. She contrasted herself as more authentic than her slick opponent, Rishi Sunak. But I mean, I would agree, generally speaking, with what people have said so far. I was speaking to Rob Ford earlier, and I think people are prepared to give Liz Truss the benefit of the doubt. They're prepared. I should say they're prepared to see what they think. You know, to make up their minds after a few days, a few weeks. But I'm not sure they are prepared to give her the benefit of the doubt yet. There is a very big package coming up on Friday. If people feel, that isn't for them, and it's living up to, some of the promises she made, as Rob Ford said, to a very unrepresentative slice of the electorate, then, things could turn quite nasty quite quickly, particularly obviously if the financial markets object to what she's doing. So I think people are, prepared to, give her a little bit of time. But we know, generally speaking, that people do make up their minds quite quickly about politicians, and then it becomes quite difficult for them to shift those perceptions. So we'll have to see. But I do think, there's been some commentary in the media, perhaps particularly in the kind of more centrist or left-wing media, that Truss just won't be able to connect with people. But I suspect that's as much wishful thinking as anything else.
Great. Thank you. So we do, before moving on to the next set of questions I have, we actually have a question from an audience member, and whoever wants to take this, just chime in. So the question is, how do you see the UK's policy developing under Truss? Obviously, it's early days, but based on what we know of her, specifically relations with the EU and Ukraine support in the war. So big question. Want to take any part of that? I didn't want to.
Well, I can take it very quickly. I mean, without wanting to kind of dominate it. I think on Ukraine, I mean, we've already seen today, actually, and in some of the things she said during the leadership contest about defence spending, that there will be absolutely no change in that respect. She already positioned herself as Foreign Secretary as taking a very hard line against Russia and even actually against China. There will be no change there. Partly, I think, because she genuinely believes it's very important to push back against Russia, and partly because as was the case with Boris Johnson, it's one thing that the Prime Minister has in common with the electorate, in that most people are, I think, not necessarily enthusiastic about the war, but sympathise very much with Ukraine rather than Russia. I think as far as the EU goes, that I think is rather more problematic, in the sense that there is an argument about Northern Ireland and trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which Liz Truss wants to free up, claiming that some of what was agreed with the EU in the withdrawal agreement, and in particular something called the Northern Ireland Protocol, has introduced a degree of friction which is unnecessary and harmful to both economies. The EU don't agree with that. So, you know, we could see a major falling out over that, particularly because Liz Truss still seems keen on bringing forward a bill in Parliament, which would make some unilateral changes, which some claim even would break international law. You know, clearly there is a possibility down the line that the EU could you know, object to this, take sanctions against the UK, as it's entitled to do, and we could get into some sort of mini trade war. And of course, there is another dimension of that issue, and that's the relationship with the US. And I don't need to tell you that President Biden is very concerned about the situation in Northern Ireland, and therefore is quite worried about this so-called Northern Ireland Protocol. And that's something that Liz Truss is going to have to handle. I think she would assume that, you know, Ukraine will help her in some ways maintain the relationship with the United States of America. But certainly today, she's made it very clear, for example, that the trade deal between the UK and the USA, which was the holy grail in some ways for some Brexiteers, is not going to happen very soon. And that, in part, is because of what's happening over Northern Ireland, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I can just jump in following on from Tim. I think one thing that's important to underline with regards to Truss and the EU is the potential trouble this is going to make for her in Parliament. One thing we haven't mentioned so far is that only about a third of Conservative Party MPs actually backed Liz Truss for leader in the parliamentary stages of the process, and that third tended to be, though it wasn't absolutely, but tended to be from the more hardline Brexity Eurosceptic wing of the party. Now, these are people who have historically shown they don't need much of a reason to cry betrayal. So Truss's dilemma is, if she goes really hardline on Europe, it risks being an issue that dominates the headlines, makes the government look out of touch with public concerns, risks a row with the US, and may well alienate the more moderate wing of her party, thus imperiling her majority in Parliament. But if she doesn't go hardline on Europe, she risks losing support from her main power base in Parliament, which is a group of people who've shown that they're very, very willing to rebel if they're not getting their way, and then she loses her majority in Parliament. So she's kind of potentially in a damned if she does and damned if she doesn't situation with that.
Great, thank you. Why don't we move on to talking a bit more about sort of the public's satisfaction or trust in government. I think there's a lot to discuss there, and I'll let you. We'll start with Jane, and then we can kind of go through everyone. And obviously, we could talk about COVID, we could talk about Boris, we could talk about Ukraine. So however you like to start, feel free, and we can go from there.
So I think it's, I don't know, obviously, what kind of context setting was done at the very start. But I think it's worth remembering in British politics that, we are coming into this particular period off the back of an incredibly tumultuous period of British politics, pretty much since 2014. that kind of series of shocks and series of volatility has taken place and has really changed the landscape in which we try to understand what's going on. Now, one of the precursors that we need to understand is the weakening attachments that people feel towards political parties in Britain. We also, we would have been thinking about British politics in a context of weakening attachments and fragmentation. So rejection of the two major parties towards smaller parties that we saw in 2015. And we would have also seen a decline in trust as being the kind of backdrop, the kind of precursor, just weakening of attachments from individuals to parties expressed through trust. And also you saw that through kind of weakening socialization of those partisan ties across generations. And so, this was very much the picture into which we kind of headed into this period. Now, what's changed since then is, of course, the Brexit EU referendum, the polarization that has brought to the surface in terms of Leave and Remain positions on Brexit. And it's also then reorganized and reorientated voters back to the two major parties. And we saw that in 2017 and we saw that in 2019. So you can kind of look at that in different ways. We don't necessarily see very strong attachments to political parties, but you saw a surge in votes for the two major parties in those elections. And you saw a surge in turnout also after the EU referendum, or at least an increase in turnout. Maybe a surge is too strong. So, that's the backdrop, this kind of incredible period where I think we're still trying to catch up and understand just how stable are these attachments that people have on the basis of Leave and Remain, and obviously in Scotland on the basis not just of Leave and Remain or of left-right politics, but also of Scottish nationalism. And then we have, okay, so that was a tumultuous period. Let's have a nice period of calm. We went straight into the pandemic. Literally the December 2019 election was kind of, okay, let's have that election, Christmas, breathe, COVID. And then, so what do we see then? Well, as we saw in many countries, some evidence of a rallying, but many people feeling concerned about the government's handling of the pandemic, very concerned about, case numbers and about the lockdowns, and, public support for lockdowns, of course, was strong at the beginning and waivers over time. And, we see a sort of strong competence story. And now we see this economic crisis. So, if we think about kind of what's trust doing in that context, it's kind of, it's a real mess actually, because on the one hand, you can point to these sort of secular declines, you can point to these secular declines in trust and attachments, but also that being exacerbated by increasing kind of performance shocks and voters looking at what happened through this whole Partygate season, the government not treating their own behaviour during the pandemic with the kind of gravity and respect that people were being asked to show. So that was, of course, highly damaging, but you've got to situate all of that within a context of stronger votes for the two major parties in the last two elections than we'd seen for a long time. And, and as people have said, a sense of wanting to give the government yet again the benefit of the doubt, hopefulness that, perhaps things will be a little bit better this time round after all of this series of kind of tumultuous British politics. So, British politics, trustworthiness, the reputation of government has taken a very, very major battering in the last year. And, we wait now to see how that fares in the context of a very, very challenging economic headwinds. So those are my thoughts. I don't know what that means really in terms of where we are, but I think it really means that we're in a very mixed picture, lots of disappointment, lots of hopes dashed, lots of people who voted for Brexit, voted for the Conservatives off the back of Brexit, starting to become extremely disillusioned, but not yet with a Labour Party that looks really strongly capable of winning hearts and minds. So we've seen Labour's vote share increase, we haven't seen the sorts of numbers switching and the attachments to the party that would really give confidence that people really have started to place their trust in this new potential government. So much change, JJ. It's so difficult when you're in the middle of things to know how it's all going to pan out.
Yes, no, absolutely. So next week you might have a different perspective than what you've just. Rob Ford, do you want to jump in and offer your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Jane gave a very masterful sort of summary of the extraordinary few years that we've been living through here and the degree of uncertainty that we all have about what may come next. I think I just add a couple of thoughts to that. The first is this new Truss government is going to have a very different issue agenda to grapple with to the previous couple of Conservative governments. What voters are paying attention to has changed dramatically. So when Johnson won in 2019, the top issues were Brexit and immigration, and both of those issues have now fallen a long way down the agenda. And that's really important because it's on Brexit and immigration that you see these former Labour voters being particularly in tune with the views of the Conservative Party, whereas on the issues that have risen up the issue agenda, the economy, the housing, inflation, cost of living, then very often these voters are some way away from at least how they perceive the Conservative Party to be. And a second problem, related problem for Truss is that on the other wing of her party, one of the things that really helped the Conservatives to retain more well-off, socially liberal, middle-class supporters in 2019, because they built a broad coalition, is a lot of hostility to Jeremy Corbyn. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty about Starmer. He's not exactly a convincing or charismatic figure, but one thing that people do seem to have picked up about him is that he isn't Jeremy Corbyn, and his Labour Party is not Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. And we've seen that in local elections and by-elections over the past years. Lots and lots of voters are now willing to vote for local opponents to the Conservative Party because they are no longer afraid of the idea of letting in a Labour Party led by somebody that they considered to be extreme. So two major headwinds for the Conservatives are a different issue agenda and a different Labour opposition that's no longer seen as threatening by voters who, for other reasons, have been losing a bit of faith in the Conservative Party. This kind of Brexit nationalist brand of conservatism isn't necessarily popular with the kind of people who were voting Conservative in, say, 2010. And then the third problem on this front, recently at a conference, I was talking to my former PhD supervisor, Steve Fisher, who's working on a book about why governments win and lose elections in the very long run. And the two-word answer, which he's writing a whole book to expand upon, is economic crisis. If a government presides over an economic crisis, there's a good chance they'll lose. If a government doesn't preside over an economic crisis, there's a good chance they won't lose. And this government is currently presiding over an economic crisis. And one way or another, that's going to make it a big mountain to climb when they eventually have to face the voters.
Can I?
Yeah, please do.
I mean, I agreed with all of that. So I'm going to talk about something slightly different, which is, I interpreted your question more perhaps with a kind of mid to post-Brexit mindset of, are Britain's political institutions in terminal decline / crisis? And I think the subtext I always think of there is, where are we on a scale from 0, everything's fine, to the US? And my sense is that, you know, a kind of fear that we might have had about the extent of polarization and the extent to which that led people to reject whole institutions because they seemed to disagree with them on the big issue of the day, that fear seems somewhat to have receded. At least that's my sense. But it's just going to be replaced by the different type of problem that we've seen much more broadly, the other big feature of 21st century politics, which is economic crisis and the impact that that has on support for example, populism and a general kind of lack of faith that political institutions can deliver what they were supposed to deliver. So I think, you know, that we're going to have that kind of decay of support for institutions, even if we've repaired them a little bit after the Brexit shenanigans.
Yes, I was going to make a comment that we're all familiar with, right? You know, James Carville, Bill Clinton's advisor, making the comment that, you know, it's the economy stupid, right? This was in the 90s, and that elections are all about, I mean, and obviously that is of course very much the case that as Rob Ford said, right now we can write entire books about this, but we are very familiar with this. Rob Johns, I wonder if you could take it back a bit, the question and to more about the Scottish voters themselves, and some of these comments that were being made about, you know, sort of from a public opinion perspective and the government, especially we have, you know, in Scotland where the Conservatives obviously did not win the election. The Scottish National Party did in the last election, and so kind of putting it into that context a bit for everyone.
Sure. Well, I guess the key bit of background for those who don't follow Scottish politics all that obsessively is that the default situation is that Scotland votes to the left, anti-conservative, and, you know, 2 times out of 3 probably gets a conservative government at the UK level. And that was the trigger for the devolution of quite a lot of powers to the Scottish Parliament back at the end of the last century, which was supposed to calm everybody down, but that for a variety of reasons hasn't really worked out. And now the kind of independence is a popular, well, kind of 45% of the electorate popular solution to this problem of the gap between Scottish and the rest of the UK's voting behaviour. But the key impact of the independence referendum campaign, in which 55% of people voted against independence, was that even if you were also anti-conservative, if you voted against independence, you recognise the "but we voted a different way" argument as one that you have considered and ultimately rejected. So I don't think that the makeup of the UK government makes all that much difference to the extent of support for Scottish independence. It makes those who support independence angrier and angrier, but it doesn't seem to be able to win more people across, exactly because they've thought about it and they kind of agree, but they didn't find that enough, even in the kind of height of austerity. So I think we're going to remain in an unpleasant kind of stasis whereby lots of Scots, I mean, if you ask Scots about their satisfaction with democracy in the UK, at the UK level and in Scotland, as the British Election Study has done throughout its panel, you see the same kind of pattern repeating itself. The people who voted for independence are very seriously dissatisfied with pretty much everything that happens south of the border. But the people who voted against independence give a similar view to the rest of voters elsewhere in the UK. And if you ask about satisfaction with democracy in Scotland, now everybody who didn't vote for independence thinks that Scottish democracy is in tatters because it's the SNP who runs things and they're the flag bearers for independence. And I think there are interesting questions. One about the Scottish National Party has now been the party of government in Scotland for 15 years. And has accumulated enough mistakes in that time, as any government, I think, could be expected to make even its supporters a little bit unimpressed by what's happening, and whether something will give there, especially in a PR context, where proportional representation context, where there could be some other parties that support independence. I think that's worth watching, but nothing has happened as yet. But on the relations with the UK front, you know, we're always, as people who are more excited by change than stasis, are looking out for, well, what will make a difference? Will it be Truss? Will it be another Conservative victory? Would it a Labour victory? Kind of cause things to change. But I'm sick of waiting for the Scottish polling picture to change. It changes very rarely. When it does, it automatically seems to go very quickly back to where it was before. So I don't think things are going to change. And I think that the feels something, yeah, you get this sense something's got to change when dissatisfaction mounts to a certain point, but I'm not sure what the trigger would be.
Thanks. Tim, do you want to jump in on any aspect of the conversation so at the moment?
Well, no, other than that, I think everything that everybody has said so far is very sensible. I think, you know, coming back to the economy, I mean, you said the economy is stupid. I do think, and you raised this in your introduction, that the UK and by implication the government is in quite a lot of trouble in this respect. You know, we do face, you know, a very high inflation rate. You know, it's come upon people quite suddenly. So it could, to use a phrase, you know, borrowed from Jane Green, it could represent an electoral shock in the sense that, you know, it could change perceptions of, you know, both the competence of the government and the kind of image of the Conservative Party, partly depending on how the Conservative Party and the government is going to react to that. Clearly, what the government has done with regard to energy bills recently, it's you know, it's capped prices, is in some senses an indication that it's willing to use the state to help people in this, you know, serious crisis. But on the other hand, she's talked an awful lot, as I say, about tax cuts, for example, and borrowing, which of course will put pressure on sterling, the currency. If that happens, that will have an inflationary effect, especially if as I say, the markets aren't confident of the government's economic policy. So we could get into a really serious situation where, you know, Truss's recipe for growth, which is tax cuts, particularly for corporations, but also for individuals, doesn't actually work or doesn't work very quickly. The economy goes into recession, partly because the Bank of England is jacking up interest rates in order to bear down on inflation, but that's taking time. And we could get into a situation, you know, which in the 70s was known as stagflation. And that will pose really major problems for the government, not least, of course, because actually people's real wages are effectively being cut. We could even get into a situation where we begin to see this in some public services, but also in the private sector as well, you know, multiple strikes, not least, you know, in very sensitive areas like the NHS. We have the nurses balloting on industrial action, for example. We will have teachers balloting on industrial action as well. So we could see a kind of perfect storm that I think, you know, would as Rob has said, you know, could sort of wash away any government. And in some ways, I guess the opposition Labour Party must, on the one hand, kind of hope that, you know, that some of the, you know, this stuff will actually happen because it will be a great advantage to the opposition. But on the other hand, they mustn't be seen to be, you know, taking any pleasure in that, or supposedly kind of talking the country down, because it's always a problem for the opposition in that sense. So I think you're right to say that, you know, the economy is a very, very big issue. That may mean, of course, that we have a Conservative government that tries to focus on other issues to some extent, to kind of distract the population, or at least mobilize the population on other dimensions. And we could therefore see a continuation and even an acceleration, an amplification of what people call a culture war or a war on woke, particularly if, you know, the Brexit identities, you know, have to some extent waned and lost their traction. You know, the Conservative government might believe that, you know, a war on woke, which, you know, encompasses universities and the issue of free speech, which encompasses the so-called civil service blob, which encompasses so-called lefty lawyers, you know, might be a way of retaining the support of some of the people who switched to the Tories in 2019, because they are quite socially conservative, or at least anxious. But I know Rob and the others will have much more to say about that than I can in terms of public opinion.
Great, thank you all. Oh, Jane, go ahead.
Oh no, I just had a one thought if I can.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
It's just extraordinary. I mean, I think it's just really worth underlining the fact that this Conservative government has been in power since 2010, has presided over austerity, coalition government. The coalition partner, the Liberal Democrats, take a lot of the blame in 2015. They presided over this enormous shock, this EU referendum that has really tilted how we kind of think about British politics. We have multiple changes of Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. And now we had, the COVID pandemic, and now we have an economic crisis. And, it's just remarkable to think how the longevity of this particular project has, really remarkably changed in this period as well. I mean, you've got the longevity of the party, but the changes that have happened within the Parliamentary Conservative Party, in the leadership of the Conservative Party and what the Conservative Party is advocating for, and the types of change in ideological kind of position that it's doing in order to try to kind of maintain this very fragile electoral coalition. It's extraordinary. And it's, you have to kind of, when you think about everything that's happened in that whole period, you have to think about the fact that this can really only go down in a negative direction now, unless there's something about the electorate that wants to cleave on to this kind of Brexit leave position and have, the longevity of that particular promise and appeal. And if only we have another chance to deliver on these Brexit dividends. I mean, that has to be the way that the coalition is held together. But you have to ask yourself, for how long is that going to last? For how long can they keep on saying, oh, no, but if you just give us one more chance, now we can deliver what Brexit was meant to deliver. It's a really long time ago. It's 6 years ago. And so I just think that, the more we talk about it and listening to colleagues, it's lovely to see you all and to listen to all your views. And, but it is really worth just remembering just how bizarre this context is in which we find ourselves. It's fascinating.
I think you'd be hard pressed to find another 12-year period with that much change and that many exogenous shocks happening and all of that. So I think, yeah, it is definitely, and we're still, it's still happening, right? It's not over. And I guess to that point, so a question that, I hear a lot over here and someone has brought up is, well, I guess two. So I'll pose the first one, which is just simply, is there a possibility of another EU referendum? So to join?
No.
No.
No. Not within 10 to 15 years minimum. There's a certain fantasist wing on the pro-EU left that you see on Twitter quite a lot, who seem to imagine that simply because they are very enthusiastic about this idea, this enthusiasm will be easy to spread to the rest of the electorate. It isn't, and it won't. And the current Labour leadership doesn't want to reopen that question, partly for the reasons that Jane's just laid out, because it would reactivate the kind of tribal Brexitism, which is probably the Conservatives' last best hope at this point. So I don't expect to see one for at least a decade.
Tim, you responded very, to that question. Do you want to?
No, I mean, I agree with Rob. I can't, I mean, he said a decade and a half. I mean, I wonder whether I'll even see it in my lifetime, to be honest. I mean, I think the whole thing was so divisive that even those who would like a closer relationship with the EU believe that they can probably get that without necessarily rejoining. I think, things have just gone too far and too badly in some senses. And then, of course, there's the question of whether the EU would want us back anyway. If they were to have us back, I think it would, let's face it, be on their terms rather than ours. And I'm not sure they're terms that most people in Britain and particularly in government would accept.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, Jane, did you want to?
Oh, and just to say, I don't think we'll have another EU referendum, but I think we'll be arguing about the terms of our relationship with Europe forever. That's not going to stop.
Mhm.
Because it's a battle, it's a competitive ground, it's unresolved, it has no sign of being fully resolved. I think the sort of shifting of the axis of, are we a little bit more pro-EU, a little bit more anti, more independent for Britain? I think that will just shift. I think you'll see people coming in and saying, well, I want closer ties, I want weaker ties, I want this, I'm going to, this is just going to go on forever, but without a referendum.
So lots more time to really keep talking about this. It won't go away anytime soon. So along the same lines of thinking about referenda, Rob, Johns, what's the sense of another Scottish referendum on independence based on what we know now?
I think very unlikely, because it's an interesting contrast with the EU case, because I was thinking when Rob was speaking that there's something neat about the fact that even if the polls show ever more support for returning to the EU, the internal politics of the Labour Party will mean that it's very unlikely to happen. And that's only apt since we only had the referendum in the first place because of the internal politics of the governing party. In Scotland, I do think the polls are more relevant. But the polls have been close enough to 50-50 for 8 years now that neither side dares to have the referendum. And from a UK government standpoint, it makes no political sense whatsoever to have the referendum, because even if you assume that governments are blithely willing to risk losing chunks of their territory, the Conservative Party support in Scotland is exclusively the most virulently anti-independence. So it would be, I think it's a kind of strange expression of personal self-confidence that David Cameron ever agreed to have the first referendum, but nobody's got that level of confidence anymore. And I don't see the UK government ever agreeing to it. And since the Scottish government doesn't really want to have it, they have to say that they do, but they don't really. It's a perfect alignment for them, because the UK government won't let them, and that's exactly what they want, is not to be allowed to have it by London. So no, I don't see it anytime soon, and the voters are so entrenched on it that, and in a way further entrenched on it by Brexit, that not much to see, I think.
Okay. Well, it sounds like status quo in terms of the state of affairs, staying out of the EU and staying and Scotland staying in. So, Rob Ford, I want to ask you a question that an audience member raised about the issue of migration. We've talked a lot about the economy as obviously a very salient issue now. And obviously migration, of course, was a huge issue at various points in the last decade, of course, during the Brexit debates, et cetera. Is this still an issue that's salient to some voters, or is it really fallen by the wayside with everything else happening?
Well, this is an area of great personal interest to me because I've been researching it for a while, but it's also an area where I think we've seen some of the most intriguing changes in politics and public opinion in the kind of past 5 to 10 years. So firstly, on the issue of salience, it really isn't. The salience of the issue has fallen through the floor since the EU referendum. At that stage, it was about 40 to 45% of the electorate were saying it was one of the most important issues on the agenda facing the country. It's now more in the range of 5 to 10%. And that's the lowest level we've seen since Tony Blair was Prime Minister in the late 1990s. But it's not just on salience that things have changed. Public attitudes towards immigrants, public attitudes about the impacts of immigration, public attitudes about the levels of immigration even, which have generally been the most negative, have all shifted a very long way in a positive direction in the past decade. And on all of those metrics where we have consistent measures going back a long time, the British public is probably more pro-immigration right now than it ever has been since we've got polling records going back to the 1960s. That isn't to say that they're mega pro-immigration. It's more that they were mega anti-immigration before, and they're not anymore. It's more sort of evenly divided. And it's not really clear why this has happened, because immigration levels have not, with the exception of the period of the pandemic lockdowns, actually fallen. So it's not that. It's not, which is a very popular argument on parts of the progressive left. It's not an example of kind of ethnocentric nationalism, because we've gone from a situation where most of the immigration was from white European countries to a situation where most of the immigration is from non-white, non-European countries, and yet at the same time public attitudes have become more positive and salience has fallen. Nor does it seem to be because people think immigration has stopped because of Brexit. In fact, the people who are most pro-Brexit and most expected immigration to fall now say that it hasn't fallen. So they are aware of the fact that it hasn't gone down, but they don't seem to be anywhere near as bothered about it now as they used to be. One thing that does seem to be playing a role is that the immigration policy framework we have now in Britain is essentially everybody gets assessed according to the same selection criteria, EU and non-EU, and you need to have essentially a certain number of points, what was referred to in the British debate as the Australian points-based system. You need high income levels, high qualification levels, various other things can chip into the pot. And broadly speaking, voters like that. Whereas broadly speaking, the EU's rights-based system of freedom of movement, voters did not like that on principle. They felt that immigration was something that should be under the discretionary control of national governments, and pretty much by definition, EU freedom of movement took away that level of discretionary control in a way that they didn't feel was appropriate. So one thing that seems to have changed is that Jonathan Portes, who also works in immigration, has called this the one Brexit success story. He's not exactly a fan of Brexit, but he says in this area, Brexit has pretty much delivered exactly what voters wanted, and public opinion has responded to that by being much happier with the outcomes it's getting, even though the outcome that they seemed to want initially, which is much lower immigration levels, hasn't actually happened. What has happened is, to coin a phrase, we've taken back control, and voters seem to like that.
Thank you. Anyone else want to, any thoughts on that topic before I move on? All right, so as you might imagine, many folks in the audience have some questions about the monarchy. And I know that none of you are experts yourselves, but I'm sure you have thoughts. So we can just kind of jump into I guess, a conversation about support for the monarchy. There's been questions, obviously, if Liz Truss has been an anti-monarchist, the fact that Charles is much less popular than Queen Elizabeth was. There's going to be, there always, of course, has been a very, a movement, an anti-monarchist movement. If we're going to see that increase, if there's going to be more of a push to move away from the model, especially as many of the Commonwealth states are talking about becoming republics. So there's a lot here to unpack, obviously, and as I said, I know that none of you are exactly experts on the topic, but I'm sure have thought about this and talked to people about this recently. So whoever might like to jump in, feel free to start us off. Jane, do you want to?
I can certainly give you my personal thoughts on this. Sure. So I think there's, obviously one of the things that we may see over time now is a weakening of the associations around kind of the Commonwealth. And I think, if we were thinking about the very, very deep genesis of support for Brexit and national identity and, patriotism, what it means to be British and what it means to live in a country where the Queen has symbolized for a really long time, the kind of Commonwealth of Nations, the historic ties to British imperial power, whether or not people, really think about, well, we were a country once that had, had so much sway and power in the world, and we're worried about that decline. I don't know that we can really evidence that, but I think of course that there is something very, very diffuse and deep around what it means to what the British nation means and how the Queen has been associated with those senses and those those feelings of the history of the country. Now it's not, so I think some of that will weaken over time, over the long term. And I think the other thing that I think has really been quite remarkable over the last kind of 10 days has been how we've celebrated the simplicity of a sort of stoic duty of a person. And I'm just going to tell you purely now, this is purely personal, kind of how I felt about it all, but it just felt like the glorification of all the wrong things over the last few years. And then it was nice to see the glorification of some of the really good things in human beings. You know, that people were saying, well, here's somebody who was quiet and dutiful and reserved and patient, and, you know, who was not self-serving, and so on and so forth. It's been really refreshing to see the celebration of those qualities of a person, in contrast to some of the things I think we sometimes glorify, which is being quite shouty and quite self-serving and quite greed-based. So those are just my views. But I think, you know, I just think over time that there will be, of course, a change now in the strength of the Commonwealth. And, you know, but Charles could be as popular. I mean, he'll never have the longevity, but he could be a closer monarch. He could be a more in-touch monarch. He could be a more open monarch. So there's definitely space for the public to really get behind him. And I think we've started to see that insofar as we can judge it in the last 10 days alone.
Thank you. Tim, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly would concur with what Jane said towards the end. I mean, Prince Charles did go through a very rocky patch when he was, Prince Charles over the whole Diana thing. You know, there were fears, I remember during her funeral, that he might even be kind of attacked, and some people suggested assassinated, so unpopular was he. That was always a bit ridiculous, but certainly I think, you know, his image among the British people has massively improved over the last couple of weeks. There's absolutely no doubt about that. What will be interesting is to see whether he will continue to, you know, air some of his views. You know, he has very strong views on green issues. Obviously strong views on the Commonwealth as well. He said that, you know, that he will no longer be putting forward those views, but they are well known. And I think it will be quite difficult on occasion for the government to do some things without people at least implying that King Charles, you know, doesn't necessarily agree with this. Having said all that, I think a lot of the talk, and I know Jane wasn't saying this, that somehow this isn't just a hiatus, but, you know, is some kind of, you know, sea change in the way that we're, you know, thinking and feeling in the UK, you know, even politically is probably overblown. I suspect that, you know, we will go back to normal. If COVID is anything to go by, people talked about how that would, you know, massively change absolutely everything. And given that 200,000 people died, you would think, you know, well, there was a fairly good chance of that. But I think it is quite remarkable how little difference that seems to have made to British politics over the last few months. So, I mean, I think it's, as Jane said, it's been, you know, an incredible moment in time, but I'm not sure that it has that many long-term implications. But, you know, I could be wrong. The person to ask really about public reaction to all this is Rob Johns, because he's been conducting a research project on all those people who queued up to pay their respects to Queen Elizabeth.
Rob, to you and the queue.
And obviously the downside of surveying the queue rather than the population as a whole is that you're getting a particular and maybe peculiar group of people. But I do think that one of the most striking features of the results of that survey was how apolitical it all felt. And I think, you know, Rob Ford's written a good deal about the ideological battles, the value battles that Brexit really crystallized. And you would instinctively think that the monarchy would probably fit pretty neatly into this, you know, young people broadly think it should be got rid of. Old people want to defend it. You know, it feels a kind of flag waving nationalist kind of thing. But we found in the survey of the queue that it was very mixed, you know, plenty of Remainers, plenty of Leavers. From wherever people were from the country, there were Remainers from there and Leavers from there. And B, it's back at the time of the Brexit referendum, you know, the national identity that was really powering this was English national identity, much more than British national identity. British, kind of the strength of British identity was, I think, gently positively correlated with voting Leave, but nothing like the kind of gradient that you get if you're asked about Englishness. And so maybe it makes sense that something that was very British in its nature is not something that fits in those same kind of Brexit flavored culture wars. So, but I think that the kind of corollary of all of this is that, you know, we will be interested in what are the political consequences of this change? And I think the answer is probably not much, because if it wasn't that political in the first place, you wouldn't expect that much by way of political implications.
No, thank you. That's really fascinating. So I'm just curious, who were you just talking to? Anyone that would talk to you and the survey team, or was there any?
No, that's my normal mode of being. But we basically used the kind of method that people use to survey demonstrations, protests, other kind of mass gatherings. So you're wanting to avoid the people who look prominent or approachable. So you find someone who looks prominent, and then you choose the person to the left of them, for example. And then you survey every nth person. In our case, we did every 9th person from them. And it's pretty straightforward in a queue that is largely static, bored out of its skulls. And you know, the only problem was with battery, because it was an online survey that we just gave them a QR code, and then they were supposed to fill in the survey as they went along. But if you've been in the queue for 5 hours and you've been bored for those 5 hours, you've not got a lot of battery left. That was overwhelmingly the biggest reason for non-response. But we got about 85% of people agreeing to do the survey, and damn right too, given how little else there was to do.
Yeah, well, there you gave them something to do. I got some interesting information. I think, you know, what you were saying, and Rob Ford, if you want to jump in on this too, is that, you know, there wasn't necessarily sort of this parallel with other ideological positioning, Leave, Remain, identity, and if that really says something about the monarchy, if it says something about the Queen herself as this sort of unifying figure that, you know, has been around for largely everyone who's alive, you know, their lifetimes. I think that's actually really interesting, that it's not, you know, that you're seeing sort of this cross section, right, of the population that's there and in the queue, and then it isn't necessarily mapping on to sort of what we might have perhaps expected based on who it might have been there. Rob Ford, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect the Queen herself would have found that quite gratifying, given that I do think a big part of her political project, or her project for the monarchy as a sort of institution, was for it to sit above politics. And we do see that a lot in all of the polling, as well as in Rob's sort of cues in the more general polling, that the kinds of divisions we see in other areas are nowhere near as acute on the monarchy. However, I do also think this is a fascinating moment in terms of that, because the Queen's reign was so long that, first of all, we don't know the degree to which that unifying quality is simply down to longevity. She's just been around for so long that she's a kind of part of the symbolic architecture of the nation for everybody. But also it means that her reign is longer than the British public opinion industry. We don't have really much polling on previous monarchs, so we don't know the extent to which views of the monarchy are actually views of the Queen that's just left us, rather than being to do with the institution more generally. So in the coming months, as the kind of big national moment of mourning and grief and queuing fades from view, and we get a kind of look at the post-Elizabeth landscape, we'll be able to sort of form a sense to which how much of what we saw with the Queen's Project of Unity actually has survived her in terms of the institution, and to what degree will the kinds of divides that we've seen in other areas start to leak into views of the monarchy. And of course, part of that will depend upon the approach and behaviour of Charles as well, and views of Charles. But it's a kind of unique moment, because now we're going to be able to separate views of the institution from views of the individual in a way that literally hasn't been possible for as long as we've had a proper polling industry in this country.
Jae-Jae, I just wondered if I could just briefly
Sure.
touch on, like, just a helpful way of thinking about kind of these different exogenous shocks, you know, because it's a little bit tempting to think, oh, well, there's all these different things that are happening. You know, there's the COVID pandemic, and then the Queen died, and then you've got Brexit, and you've got the cost of living crisis, and all of these shocks that could change something. And I, without wanting to kind of do a book plug, but just to try to say, like, one of the examples we used of an exogenous shock that we didn't think would be an electoral shock was the death of a monarch, because, you know, just because something happens that is a major salient moment that everybody recognizes, that cuts through. I mean, this is the, you know, if you're thinking about public attention and salience, this is, you just, you know, the world has paid attention to this, not just British voters. However, it's not politicized. So if you think about the relevance of these kinds of events and exogenous shocks for changing something important in an electoral way, there has to be a change or a contestation or a different political response that means that voters then look to different political parties offering different political choices on this salient moment. And, you know, so therefore, I mean, nobody was suggesting that the death of the monarch is an electoral shock, but it's kind of like, I think it's a useful way of thinking about, well, what really should change things and what shouldn't change things. If there's been a consensus around the public's attitudes towards an institution or towards an event, and there isn't a lot of political contestation around it, then it really shouldn't shift very much in the electorate, at least in electoral terms. And I think, you know, the COVID pandemic was another example of this, a shock for sure, but not necessarily an electoral shock, because you didn't really see very clear contestation around, for example, whether or not it was right for the country to lock down or whether it wasn't, and clearly there was a lot of argument about how well the government was handling that. But it's just a nice kind of way of thinking, well, what should our expectations be across all of these different events? And clearly, you know, therefore, I think if you're thinking about something of this nature, you're thinking about the kind of diffuse, very, very hard to assess, very hard to measure changes that might happen around the kind of public psyche. But like Rob says, now we get a little bit of covariation, at least, that we can see, but I wouldn't expect this to have a major effect.
It's a good point to end, I think, on that topic. So I'm aware of the time, and we're getting towards the end of our time. I wanted to give everyone a chance to just kind of round out add any comments. And we've obviously covered a lot of territory, and we could keep talking for another 2 hours. We won't, don't worry. But just to kind of do a round and give everyone a chance to add any final comments on any of the various topics that we've covered. So Tim, I'll let you start.
Well, I mean, as someone who's very interested in the Conservative Party, you'd expect me to say something about them, but actually we haven't really talked very much about the opposition Labour Party, and it might be worth thinking about, you know, how they're doing and what their strategy will be to handle Liz Truss. They have, to a certain extent, had it easy over the last few months because Boris Johnson has become so unpopular that simply not being Boris Johnson has been a big advantage to Keir Starmer. Particularly because Keir Starmer could present himself as, you know, far more sober, far more, if you like, rational, and far more sensible and to some extent far more honest than Boris Johnson. Liz Truss is obviously a known quantity to the Labour Party, but you know, she does pose some problems. She clearly has a sense of direction, which Boris Johnson never really had, for good or ill, I guess, because if that direction, you know, is terribly ideological, it might be a real problem for the Conservative Party and therefore an advantage for the Labour Party. But, you know, someone who knows what they think might not be a bad thing. She's, not a charismatic communicator, but she is a fairly direct communicator, and that may go down better with the country than some people imagine. The Labour Party's also got some problems of its own. That there is still still relatively small, but still quite vocal, unreconciled left wing who regards Starmer, as a complete betrayal of everything that the Labour Party should stand for, and for socialism in particular. And so he does have to iron out those problems. The other interesting question for the Labour Party is proportional representation. And there is a very big move in the Labour Party, and its conference is currently coming up, and that's where policy, officially anyway, is made to get the Labour Party to promise proportional representation in its next manifesto. If that is the case, if Keir Starmer gives in to that, he doesn't seem particularly keen, but if he does give into that and it appears in the Labour Party manifesto, and Labour were to win the election, or at least emerge as the largest party, then that really would make a very, very profound change to the country if the Labour government, or minority Labour government, or indeed a majority Labour government, was somehow to introduce it. But then that raises the question of quite how they would do it. Do we really want another referendum? Can you introduce such a big constitutional change without one? Who knows?
That is a good point to leave us thinking. Rob Johns.
I was hoping you'd come somebody else next, but I guess I'll talk about the next election. It seems to me that let's say there were three key criteria in the 2019 election, as there often are. Which of the two major parties seems the most competent? Which of the two major parties is closest to voters on the kind of the left-right economic dimension, and which is closest to voters on the more prominent, and especially prominent in 2019, the kind of vertical dimension that has Brexit very prominent, but is also immigration and culture wars and all of that kind of stuff. The Conservatives won 2-1 on that in 2019. They were further from voters on economics, but they were closer on the other stuff, and they were more competent. For 2024, the big, I think, unknown really is what Liz Truss will do to reconcile the fact that her ideological instincts and her supporters within the party are a long, long way from voters who have some fairly populist left views on economics. I think unless, and so events like Friday's announcements are really, really important for getting a sense of whether this is going to be tax cuts for millionaires or handouts to lots and lots and lots of people, because I think that's where her hopes lie. I think the economic competence is kind of, Steve Fisher's explained that they're going to be in big, big trouble on that point with his, if there's an economic crisis, you lose. So she's going to lose probably, but the one hope, I think, is by tacking to the centre on economics. So it'll be interesting to see whether she does any of that.
Thank you. Rob Ford.
Yeah, I think I would kind of just add 2 points to what's already been said. And again, looking forward to the next general election, which is what everybody will be doing now. We have what's likely to be the roster of contenders decided. I mean, Boris might come back if it goes really bad for Truss, but I wouldn't expect it. On leadership, I think there's a lot of anxiety in Labour that Starmer could be, that in seeking to avoid Corbyn 2.0, they end up with Miliband 2.0, with a leader who's a bit bland, who voters don't particularly connect to, and as a result they blow what should be a strong position. But it's possible instead that Starmer could end up being like Thatcher was in the late 1970s. It's often forgotten that in the 1979 election, and unusually in the historical record, Thatcher trailed the incumbent prime minister on most metrics of leadership. People liked Jim Callaghan. They thought he was competent. They thought he was experienced. They didn't really know at that stage what Margaret Thatcher stood for. That came later. But of course, none of that was enough to save Callaghan in a very severe economic situation. All that Thatcher had to be was a kind of steady and acceptable alternative to what was by then a really crisis-laden government. So in a sense, what Labour will hope is that the situation is more like Thatcher versus Callaghan than Cameron versus Miliband. But the second point I'd make with respect to the Conservatives is to do with geography. So the problem the Conservatives have in terms of where should they put their economic policy is that wherever they put their economic policy, they end up annoying one half of what is now a very heterogeneous coalition. The kinds of voters and places that Johnson won over in 2019 want intervention, want change, want spending, want redistribution. The kinds of places that have voted Conservative for a long time before that, who were the sort of Cameron Conservatives of 2010, don't want any of those things. They want no housing, no building, no planning reform, no pro-growth reform, no money sent up north, less taxes. And the problem is, whatever this Conservative government does, it risks seriously annoying one end or the other of that coalition, which could make it very hard to hold that coalition together through to the next election.
Great. And Jane, to round us out.
Oh, well, I guess for me, there's two things that I am really interested in, and I don't yet have a very good sense or understanding of. I think one is, there has been a very, very important realignment, and, the shifting of explaining or understanding people's vote choices now based on age and education in the last two general elections has been very, very strong. Now that's partly about Boris, and it's partly about Brexit, it's partly about these other culture war issues. Yes, we're going back into a much more domestic economic political sphere, but our theories would tell us that those realignments happen infrequently and that they're quite difficult to, it should be quite difficult for them to take place, and therefore it should be quite difficult for them to unwind. Do we expect this realignment to unwind in a period of only a few years? Given that Brexit will still be unresolved, given that the incumbent party certainly has a very, very strong incentive to keep on replicating, keep some kind of inertia or kind of solidity in this new pattern of vote choice. And I think, so that for me is a big kind of unknown, within this kind of precursor of volatility, can we see a new period of relative stability given how hard it is for those changes to take place, and the fact that they're deep and meaningful, they're not just a sort of flash in the pan. I think the other question is, in 2017, we had this election campaign where we had Theresa May, who was very untested as a campaigner, and we had Jeremy Corbyn that people hadn't yet formed their views about. We're going to have another election campaign with two leaders that are going to be relatively well known, but they're not going to have been campaigning together in a short campaign. So, so that election really did shift quite a bit. It really did bring people back to the Labour Party who were undecided. So, I think it would be fascinating to see those two and see how they campaign together, because neither of them are really electrifying campaigners, at least so far, on the basis of evidence so far. So that will be really interesting. But otherwise, nothing more to add, just lots of fascinating times ahead.
Great. I think that's a good point to end on. I want to thank you all for joining us today. And this was a really fascinating conversation. I know we covered a lot of territory, and as I said, of course, could have stayed on for longer. I want to thank the audience as well, and for all of the questions that you added to the conversation. And I'll send it back over to Joe to end today's event. Oh, you're muted, Joe.
Thank you. I would just like to thank everyone and thank the participants. And in the chat as a brief survey, we'd appreciate it if you fill it out. It's kind of a government requirement. So thank you again.